Now, racists see no difference between ethnicity and culture, believing that the latter is entirely contingent on the former. And the Australian left also buys into this ethnicity equals culture myth
when it suits their purposes, especially when dealing with Aboriginal issues. But even a simple observation shows that one's culture has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with environment. And in Australia, the most famous example of this is Mai Kwong Tart. Originally a Chinese immigrant lured here by the gold rushes, Kwong Tart became one of Sydney's most successful merchants and made a significant impact on the social and political scene of late 19th century New South Wales. Despite the virulent anti-Chinese agitation in Australia at the time, Kwong Tart was, according to the Daily Telegraph, well known to the Governor himself and quite popular among all classes in Sydney. He was appointed to a Royal Commission into Gambling in 1892, and there was a massive funeral when he died in 1903. And this is only 2 years after the institution of the White Australia policy. So what's going on here? How can we reconcile this massive disconnect? Well, it wasn't his ethnic Chineseness that Australians looked at and considered important. It was his cultural Britishness, at least in his public dealings. You see, Kwong Tart was a Chinese orphan. He was raised in China by Scottish missionaries. And although Kwong Tart's now largely remembered as a uniquely 19th century character, a Chinese mandarin who adopted the dress and manners of an English gentleman and was renowned for his public performances of Scottish songs, his life and success demonstrated that for Australians, even at the height of white Australia, they actually cared less about his race or ethnicity and far more about his cultural assimilation. Now, at this stage, it's also important to have a brief discussion on public versus private culture. I don't deny that there are a multiplicity of non-Anglo cultural practices that happen in private in Australia, but any formal policy of multiculturalism seeks to give official imprimatur to activities in the public sphere that differ from existing Anglo cultural practices. True multicultural theory, and this is most clearly expressed in the Canadian theorists, says that all cultures are not merely to be tolerated, but to be embraced and to be welcome alongside the existing ethos. You see, for multiculturalists, every culture is equally worthy of public recognition and acceptance. So it's not good enough simply to show that there are existing non-Anglo cultural practices being undertaken in the private sphere and claim that fact as definitive proof of national multiculturalism. I mean, after all, even at the height of white Australia, non-Anglo communities in Australia still retain such private cultural practices. And if multiculturalism as an official policy doesn't mean recognition of public differences, then the official policy of multiculturalism means effectively nothing. But back to my main question, is Australia a multicultural nation? Let's examine this question by assessing 6 key delimiters of any culture, whether it be Australia, Azerbaijan, Albania or Afghanistan: language, law, food, religion, clothing and entertainment. Let's start with language. Is there any doubt that that English is the common language of Australia? Canada adopts a strict policy of having 2 official languages, as does Belgium. Switzerland has 4 official languages. So there are multicultural societies that recognise language differences and mandate diversity in official languages, but not Australia. Sure, there are people who speak a different language at home, but how's this different from 150 years ago when there was no official policy of multiculturalism? Some people claim that SBS is an example of linguistic multiculturalism, but this is a furphy. Overlook for a moment the fact that SBS's ratings generally fall in the realm of statistical error, except when they show South Park or they showed The Ashes and ask, why are all the captions in English? Because the mode of universal public discourse in Australia is English. And perhaps a final word should go to the editor-in-chief of Australia's own dictionary, the Macquarie. Australia is essentially a monolingual country despite its long history of migration from Europe and Far Eastern countries. The effect of these migrations on our vocabulary has not been very great, and the history of foreign words in Australian English owes more to European intellectual and artistic tradition than our migration history. So, on the issue of public use of language, monocultural. The law. In Australia, the law system is conducted in English, based on English common law traditions, with people in outfits coloured black to mourn the death of English Queen Anne, whose laws are made in Parliament based on English and US models, where all business is also conducted in English. I may have missed it, but where's the multiculturalism in the process of making and interpreting laws? There's no recognition of cultural differences in the laws of the land either. There's no recognition of Muslim divorce laws in the Marriage Act. There's no subsidy for FGM under Medicare. There's no recognition of cultural differences in determining size limits for fishing regulations. Basically, the law recognises only one Australia and one type of Australian. Thus, on the issue of law, monocultural. Food. Say the multiculturalists, you've forgotten food. Look how multicultural Australia has become. Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese, Indian, Portuguese, chicken, pizza and cappuccinos. That proves we're multicultural after all. Well, maybe, maybe not. Most of the things that I've mentioned have been anglicised to meet traditional Australian tastes, and many of them have come to Australia through other English-speaking cultures beforehand, such as the US and Britain. Sure, there are foods different from the traditional steak and veg of Australia in the 1950s, but did Britain become multicultural when tomatoes, potatoes, corn, coffee and chocolate came in from the Americas in the 16th century? If we look to the imported foods which have really grabbed hold of the Australian public, they are overwhelmingly fast foods that are American in origin or ethnic dishes that have been reconstructed in the image of white America to suit their tastes. Thus, on the issue of food, essentially monocultural. Religion. Well, Australia has no official state religion, and since the days of Reverend Samuel Marsden, the flogging parson, Australians have maintained a very healthy scepticism for religion in public life. Sectarian issues that have arisen in the past are rightly recognised as the eruption of the private into the public sphere. There are many different faiths in Australia, all of which can be freely practiced in private. So does that make us multicultural? If so, how then does that vary from when there was no official policy of multiculturalism? There were Jews in the First Fleet. Was Australia therefore multicultural at that point before any official policy was needed? There is, however, still some official recognition of religion, but we've been very picky in what we choose to recognise. When it comes to the public culture of the nation, we have the Christian Lord's Prayer at the start of each day of Parliament. Moreover, we only recognise the Christian religious holidays as public holidays, and even in this regard we accept the Catholic rather than the ironically more accurate Orthodox dates for these celebrations. Thus, on the issue of the public recognition of religion, monocultural. Clothing. Suits and dresses, most of which follow a European or US design. Jeans, sneakers, t-shirts and baseball caps. Even all US cultural imports that have become de rigueur, even for the young, and especially among the disgruntled members of Australia's ethnic minorities. How many muumuus do you see in Parliament? How many saris? Not even a Nehru or a Mao jacket, given their beef popularity of the 1960s. That's why the issue of Islamic dress for women has become something of a cause célèbre. In a country where, in earlier years, Jewish rabbis dressed in the manner of a Lutheran priests to fit in with the prevailing culture, the intrusion of overt religious symbology through dress into the public sphere has produced an unsurprising backlash. The Muslim community has, not unreasonably, expected that Australia would actually live up to its official policy of multiculturalism. Nobody appears to have told them that in our hearts we don't really mean it. Conversely, I suspect that the majority of those Australians who are offended by the burqa wouldn't give two hoots if women wore Islamic dress in their own homes. Australians are fundamentally indifferent to what people do as long as they keep it in private. But venture into the public sphere in niqab, and that intrudes upon the demand for homogeneity. It becomes a challenge, a threat to Anglo-societal norms. Norms which, it must be stated, have been overwhelmingly endorsed and adopted by all subsequent waves of immigrants since World War II. In fact, the very existence of a controversy over Islamic head coverings is perhaps the best evidence I can adduce that we are not, when it comes to clothing, a multicultural society. Thus, on the issue of clothing, monocultural. Entertainment. What's the trait most often proclaimed of Australians? We're a sports-loving nation. And where do we get our sport from? Britain and the US, or 19th century homegrown derivatives of those sports. Where do we get our movies and TV from? Overwhelmingly from Britain and the US. Going to the opera? Look out for the surtitles. in English. Heading to the beach. One of the great ironies of the Cronulla riots was that we had two groups of people in conflict, both of whom were essentially mimicking different versions of US subcultures, the white West Coast beach culture versus the black urban ghetto culture. And despite their claims of cultural authenticity on both sides, they had the look and talk of their US compatriots, demonstrating an almost hilarious lack of introspection and a deeply ironic subservience to US culture. Tuning the radio, more rock and pop. In other words, direct or derivative expressions of the US and Britain. Or talkback, based on a US model. Prefer ABC FM? How about a nice 19th century piece from Dvorak? Even Triple J, that doyen of wokeness, dropped its world music show for an increase in US-style hip-hop. Why? Because the youth market, as opposed to the tiny group of middle-class Gen Xers posers that they were catering for, didn't really give a stuff about the sounds of Africa and South America. They wanted American rap. The simple fact is that things like SBS, WOMAD and the now defunct Carnivale in Sydney have all been of minuscule influence in comparison to mainstream Australian entertainments. They're bursts of exotic, primarily for the consumption of bourgeois leftists, who can then convince themselves that they really are broad-minded and people of the world. But how many Australians even know these exist? How many actually go and participate as to those who go to the footy or sit at home and watch the footy? Thus, on the issue of entertainment, monocultural. So what are we? I've gone through 6 key markers of culture. Any serious and objective examination can only lead to one conclusion. We're not multicultural, at least not in terms of Australia's public culture. What we are is a very successful multi-ethnic society that has maintained a high degree of stability. How has that stability come about? By official and more recently unofficial coercion of immigrants towards assimilation into the dominant Anglo culture. Not merely by Anglos, but also by non-Anglo migrants who themselves have assimilated in the past. Australia, for all practical purposes, remains the same monoculture that we've been for most of Australia's white history, at least as far as our public culture is concerned. And governments have come to understand this. In the 36 years since the policy of multiculturalism was first proclaimed by Al Grasby, successive governments have whittled away and read down the official definition of multiculturalism, always in deference to the preponderant position of the dominant Anglo culture. Indeed, the current definition of multiculturalism could be summed up thus: you can do most of what you would like in private, but don't transgress the boundaries that have been set by the dominant Anglo culture. In your public dealings, you have to be like us, and in return we'll treat your non-threatening practices as a quaint and interesting form of exotica if we don't just ignore them entirely. And that's why Australian multiculturalism is a myth. Thank you.
Thank you, Satya. Hello, everyone. If Western civilisation bores you, but you don't want to leave the room, you can tune into interstate tax competition next door. It's a great honour to follow the great Peter Phelps. He needs to be in Parliament. He should be in Parliament. But just like Tony Abbott, Peter's contribution to Australia over the next 25 years is going to be no less, if not greater, than what he's done in Parliament. And it is great to see my colleague Tom Switzer, the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies. Tom was the very first person to run me in a newspaper in Australia when Tom read still the most important opinion page in the country at the Oz and then at the Fin. And what the CIS is doing is very important. And on Western civilisation, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, what the CIS is doing, what the IPA is doing, what the MRC is doing, what Mancal is doing, is all absolutely on the same page and all completely important. As you can tell, that's just my picture. There's no PowerPoint presentation. I thought I would just talk for 10 minutes about where I see the debate about Western Civ, and it's very interesting following from Peter because The debate about multiculturalism in Australia, I see, is a subset of the bigger debate around Western civilisation. And I think the debate about multiculturalism, and first started a number of years ago by Mark Lopez, who started to unpack the political discourse of multiculturalism, revealed a precursor to the debate we're having now about Western civilisation. And when Peter talked about Quang Tat, that provided a wonderful starting point for me in the brief points I want to make about Western civilisation, which is for us, and I'm very influenced by the great Larry Sedentorp in this regard, Western civilisation, first and foremost, as we understand it, gave us the concept of the individual. The individual, of course, within their community, there you go. I'll make all these climate change, global warming, I live in Melbourne jokes, but renewables. Well, actually, it's funny we're sitting in the dark. My son is at a Catholic secondary school in Melbourne. It's a good school. They had Earth Day, and to celebrate education and progress, they turned off the lights for 2 periods. Western civilisation gave us the idea of the individual. Without the concept of the individual, there is no concept of rights. There is no concept of choice and responsibility. I would argue that is one of the bases on which we see the argument against any concept of Western civilisation from the prevailing cultural and political hegemony. There's a broader point about Western civilisation. Western civilisation, and of course the debate against and the push against any concept of Western civilisation, reveals something for me that I think the left understands so much better than the centre-right, or libertarians understand it, liberals and conservatives don't. Politics, and we've already heard this phrase a few times over the last few days, politics is downstream of culture. I, in my position at the IPA, see so often we get caught up on the economics, we get caught up on tax, we get caught up on budget deficits, as important as they are. But if we don't understand the culture, soon we won't just be able to not have those debates, but we are going to be losing all those other things that make us a free society. And one of my very great frustrations, and a few people over the last few days have asked me, am I still a Liberal Party member, because I've spoken at Australian Conservatives events. I spoke at the launch of the great Robert Kennedy's campaign for the LDP in Victoria. Am I still a member of the Liberal Party? And I say, well, yes, today, but ask me tomorrow. And I've been doing that for 35 years. The very great frustration of the Liberal Party as a mainstream political organisation is the refusal of most of its MPs to understand the importance of culture. They have been completely sucked into the concept of culture wars without understanding that when anyone argues against you fighting the culture wars, it means they do not want you to challenge their hegemony. So that is the point about Western civilisation, that it is a really interesting example of the failure of Marxism. Marxism is primarily an economic and then a cultural phenomenon, and ideology. But Western civilisation, as we understand it, and we can have a 2-week debate about what Western civilisation is, but if we understand it to be broadly, exactly as Peter said, a Judeo-Christian cultural ethic, religious ethic of the last 2,500 years, transcends economics. The point about Western civilisation is that at its heart, it's about the individual. It is the individual experiencing beauty, belonging, something transcendental. All of these things completely antithetical, completely opposed to the idea of our culture and community as promulgated by the left. The idea that there is something beyond us. There is something beyond what we are doing right now to the community, to perhaps an afterlife, to the rest of society, completely cuts against any idea that the left have of what the community and culture and individuals are, basically as economic units. The other point about Western civilisation is at its heart, and it's got many dimensions, but a core dimension is religion. And exactly as Peter said, and he's exactly right, religion is a key cultural identifier. When we listen, sadly, to most of it comes out of Sydney University, when we listen to the attacks and the diminution of Western civilization as a concept, it's about religion. And the point about religion is not just that it gives us meaning. Religion is a key bulwark between the individual and the state. Every totalitarian regime, right and left, comes after the bulwarks between the state and the individual. Religion, family, civil society. Those are the things that protect us from totalitarian governments, which is why totalitarian governments aim to tear them down. And they are all products of Western civilization in a way that is not found in any other system or culture. A few other characteristics of Western civilization. Western civilization, by its very nature, the 2,500 years that we celebrate, respects tradition. It is organic. It is not created by the state. It is not created as a result of a public edict or diktat. It is organic. The idea that something is traditional, that something is organic, that something is worth preserving, again, cuts across every aspect of the Platonic worldview of the left, which is we can construct something ab initio. And for me, this is absolutely Edmund Burke and his reflections on the French Revolution. It is the difference between the state or a group of individuals constructing something absolutely abstracted from history, experience, culture, religion, family, social practices. Western civilization, we need to understand, is not just a debate about dead white males, most of whom are European. The very concept of something beyond ourselves strikes at the heart of the progressive project. And that's, I think, really significant. The other thing about Western civilization is it's modest, it's humble, it learns, it changes. That modesty, that idea of Western civilization that has given us the left and the right and liberalism and progressivism and social democracy is a very function of Western civilization itself, as the concept of Western civilization changes and morphs and is malleable. Again, that completely cuts across the worldview of the left and progressive academics. It completely cuts across the worldview of Marxism, of economic determinants, of the inevitability of history. 5 minutes of studying Western civilization makes you understand absolutely nothing is inevitable. But to argue against the inevitability of history, the inevitability of class consciousness, is to, as I mentioned, absolutely destroy the progressive project. What we've seen in the debate in Australia, first about multiculturalism, now about Western civilization, is an unpacking of all of these things. And I know that Daisy will probably talk about the Ramsay Centre, and we can talk for 2 weeks about how that reveals the complete failure of the cultural right to have any impact whatsoever on higher education in Australia, in the same way as the rejection of the Bjorn Lomborg Centre by every university in Australia similarly revealed it a few years ago. The point about the Ramsay Centre, and this was brought home to me when the IPA brought out Professor Mark Bauerlein, a Professor of English at Emory University, who's now the editor of First Things. And sometimes, as you know, it takes an international visitor who's not living in the bubble to identify what this is about. And he talked about these things, and he talked about the purposes of Western civilization. But he said, you know what, coming from Atlanta, coming from the US, looking at the debate about Ramsay, and not just the debate about Ramsay, but getting any great books course in, getting any part of our 2,500 year human history project into universities in a way that's different from the left-wing project, reveals one important thing. The left completely get it. They will not allow one single sliver, not one single sliver of Western civilization of our culture into their university. As Bauerlein said, and the same thing applies in the States, the arts is this big, humanities is this big. In the same way as Sydney University and other universities now, UQ, are opposing any concept of the great books, for example, the same thing's happening in the US. And as Bauerlein said, the courses are this big. They will not give anyone who opposes them that much because they know what will happen. As Bauerlein said, they know that if you give kids that much, and that little much contains Dostoevsky, Mozart, Beethoven, Shakespeare, Dante, that is going to go to that. And that's what this is about, and that's what I think is really exciting about this debate about multiculturalism, about Western civilization. We are now starting to get it, and public demand for the ideas, public demand and community support for the fact that we are bigger than just ourselves, we are bigger than just what we do right here and now, is absolutely part of Western civilization. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. Western civilization, that beautiful mistress, that miraculous entity forged in blood and aspiration, that through brawn and creativity has manifested this extraordinary society in which we are so privileged to live. Liberty, personal autonomy, democracy, free speech, religious freedom, the separation of church and state, free market capitalism, the emancipation of women, the ability of every human being to thrive, to pursue, to create, to invent, to live their very best lives as their very best selves, free from tyranny, oligarchy, or compulsory theological orthodoxy. Who the hell on this planet wouldn't want to live in such a paradise of individualism? Well, I can give you one group who doesn't. They are a class of people born between 1981 and about 1998, who, subject to so-called helicopter parents and bestowed with more privileges than any other generation ever, have earned a reputation for being difficult, pessimistic, and above all, whiny. They are overeducated, underemployed, and afflicted with a deep and rather worrying sense of nihilism, despite a bounty of facilities bestowed upon them by, well, Western civilization. Colloquially known as Generation Snowflake, or Generation I won't take an entry-level position because Mummy and Daddy told me that I was special and unique, I am talking, of course, about millennials. Oh, millennials. Ugh. What happened? What went wrong? How could the most educated, connected generation ever, who was raised on The Simpsons and South Park, turn into such a cynical bunch of hypersensitive petals? Millennials were once the great hope for the progression of Western civilization, but now bear with them an existential threat of a great and very unfortunate, regression of the West, both culturally and economically. As such, millennials really are terrifying. They are a problem. And while I am admittedly very harsh on my own generation, in fact, I have made somewhat of a career of making fun of them, I have good reason for doing so. The fact that the generation taking the reins of the free world is advocating for less freedom rather than more freedom is of genuine concern. So let's have a look at millennials. Who are they? Who hurt them? What do they want? And are they destroying Western civilization, or is Western civilization destroying them? Now, millennials can be split into two subcategories. You've got Generation Y, which is my half, the vaguely sensible half, born from 1981 to about 1992. And then you have what you'd call the lower millennials, which are the rest. Millennials are, as we know, largely left-wing and seem to be becoming increasingly that way as more and more of them come through the state-sanctioned socialist empire, otherwise known as university. In fact, in 2017 in the UK, just 27% of voters aged 18 to 34 voted Tory, whereas 59% of them supported Labour's Jeremy Corbyn. Australia is similar. At the 2013 federal election, about 60% of millennials voted for the Labor Party. I'm sure they're all very disappointed now. And in the USA, it is the same story. According to Pew Research in 2017, 55% of millennials had held mostly or consistently left-wing views, as opposed to only 12% identifying as either mostly or consistently conservative. No mention of libertarians for some reason. Now, this would be okay if by left-wing they mean they were simply proponents of fairness and workers' rights and personal freedom. But it goes well beyond that. According to a survey by the Centre for Independent Studies in 2018, thank you, Tom Switzer, 58% of millennials favour socialism. You know, the greatest ideological failure in human history, which has consistently led to starvation, violence, and death, and has never, ever, 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 ever worked, ever, every time it has been tried.
It's not true socialism.
Not true socialism. They like the idea of that. Not only that, the CIS found that about 60% of millennials believe that capitalism has failed and that the government should exercise more economic control. This is despite the fact that they tweet about the failings of capitalism from their smartphones and their laptops while sipping iced lattes and listening to their favourite tunes on Spotify, which are all products of capitalism. The irony is strong. Needless to say, this is an intellectually lazy way to look at the world, which brings me to probably the single greatest problem with millennials: ignorance. And not only ignorance, but a genuine unwillingness to seek out different opinions or to be critical of the media. What millennials are ignorant of is that, according to the Heritage Foundation, capitalism is actually the #1 antidote to global poverty. And also, the freer the economy, the higher the standard of living. And also, let's be fair, they don't actually know what socialism is. They think it's what goes on in Scandinavia, and anyone with a basic grasp of economics and history or the ability to do a quick Google search will tell you that it's not the case. Yet despite all of this readily available information, millennials still swallow the lefty Kool-Aid spun to them by BuzzFeed, HuffPost, The Guardian, the ABC, and above all else, whatever Zuckerberg and co. decide that they are allowed to see on social media platforms. And now this brings me to what has really messed up millennials beyond anything else: the internet. The internet, that great, lawless, wild west of technology, is what is really responsible for the terrible anxiety, cynicism, and general lack of critical thinking skills displayed by such a large chunk of millennials. It is the echo chambers on social media where they relentlessly try to out-virtue each other that have spawned things like the victim mentalities and identity politics and the complete misconception they have of socialism. Now, since all of this is done with zero face-to-face interaction, millennials' ability to communicate has significantly deteriorated. And because everything looks worse in print, getting into a really vicious argument on the internet is really all part and parcel of a day's work. And as such, everything, even the smallest dispute for millennials, becomes deeply personal, which is not very healthy. And so it stands to reason, therefore, that a pack mentality is formed, which has led to things like third and fourth wave feminism. Now, insecure millennial women, fostered by immature Generation X and baby boomer child ladies, band together, encourage resentment rather than self-improvement, and insist that every single problem they have is the fault of the patriarchy. They also unite under a hatred of a common enemy, the straight white man. Now, this attitude is absolutely contrary to the Western Enlightenment values of individualism and aspiration in favor of a sort of Bolshevik-style Machiavellian collectivism, a regression from the West, if you will, and truly a worrying one. However, if you thought this kind of attitude was isolated to millennial women, well, you would be wrong. According to the General Social Survey in the USA, there is a sharp decline in sex amongst adults aged 18 to 29, so what you would call the lower millennials. And this is contrary to every societal stigma you can imagine, driven by young men. So the survey revealed that 23% of these lower millennials reported no sex in the past year, which has gone up about 15% since 2008. Male and female young people have gone from being roughly on par when it came to celibacy to a full 28% of men aged between 18 to 29 reporting no sex in the past year, as opposed to only 18% of young women. And while celibacy amongst young women has gone up 8% since 2008, the amount of young men not having sex has almost tripled since then, going up 18%. Big disparity. Side note, Generation Y, so my end of the millennials, is actually the most sexually active of all generations, with just 7% reporting celibacy. So we're doing just fine. Now, there are a number of factors, like, say, Netflix and video games, that could contribute to this celibacy amongst young men, but they are symptomatic of certainly a larger cultural problem. Third and fourth wave feminism depict young men as sexually voracious predators who are to blame for literally everything that is wrong. They are accused of perpetuating so-called rape culture and risk being accused of sexual harassment simply for approaching a girl in a bar. Now, this is not entirely the fault of young women. I mean, they have been fed a feminist lie so profound that they truly believe that all men are rapists in waiting. Young men, thanks to this cesspool of toxic femininity, have lost all confidence in themselves and in women and are just giving up, which I think is incredibly sad. And it has certainly yielded some unhealthy consequences. Some of you may have heard of a philosophy called MGTOW, or men going their own way. It's actually pronounced MGTOW, but I think MGTOW sounds better because MGTOW sounds like something the doctor prescribes for an infection. Anyway, the philosophy of MGTOW is simple. They are men who are what you would call confirmed bachelors, men who turn away from the societal pressures of relationships and women and in favor of a life of forging their own way and chasing their own pursuits. Now, this is a very justifiable pushback against militant feminism, and I understand it and have no problem with it. However, similar to feminism, along with its good faith actors, MGTOW comes with a rather toxic contingent of, from my observation, largely millennial men who use the movement as an excuse to vent their anger and frustration at a sort of gynocentric world. And just like militant feminists hate and blame men, MGTOW extremists gather in echo chambers on YouTube and Reddit, including my YouTube channel, blame all their misfortunes on feminism, demonize women as a whole, and engage in what you would call Old Testament anti-Western misogyny. They insist that all women, and they do mean all women, are gold-dinging whores whose only motivation in life is to strip men of their resources and drain them emotionally. They believe a woman having more than one or two sexual partners lowers her overall worth as a human being, rendering her more like a used car than a person. And that is an actual analogy I have seen them use. They believe that a woman's sole purpose is to facilitate the needs of men, and even believe that women should lose the right to vote. Now, needless to say, this attitude flies right in the face of Western values of the emancipation of women and free speech and personal liberty and just generally not being a terrible person. So it's interesting these MGTOW millennial extremists only seem to have this gripe with Western women. They have rejected Western values in favor of a regression into a sort of medieval patriarchy where women are considered akin to property and livestock. And this, I'm sure you would agree, is of concern. Now, in some ways, it is understandable why millennials have rejected Western capitalism and innovation. The perpetual coddling they received growing up has made the concept of doing anything for themselves not only unappealing, but alien. So, of course, they're drawn to this socialist, Marxist, anti-Western ideology that does everything for them. Individualism and Enlightenment values have been thrown out of the window for tacky, easy, intellectually lazy collectivist thought, where the success of one group depends on the downfall of another, rather than striving for success as individuals while helping each other along the way. Now, I'm fully aware that I've spent the last 12 or so minutes ruthlessly bashing my generation. And I have to be fair here. Millennials do have a lot of anxieties that are particular to them, like lack of wage growth, etc., etc. So here's my message to all millennials. Despite what you've been told by activists in the media and your ridiculous university professors, the world really is yours for the taking if you choose to take it. Western civilization, rather than being a dreadful product of colonialism and racism, has done more to liberate the underprivileged around the world than any other society on the planet ever. It is a privilege to live and operate within it. I know we have problems. I know we are going to inherit chaos. But as the most educated, connected generation ever, we should be the most creative, the most innovative. We should be the most positive about our future because we do have the tools to fix it. So if we can just stop complaining, please, for just 1 minute, and embrace the beautiful West rather than rallying against it, we can actually make this change. Thank you.
Thanks for that. My name is Satya. I'm the Director of Policy at this little organization called the Taxpayers Alliance, and I write for a bunch of newspapers. If you want to know more, type my name into Google. If you can spell it correctly, then I'll be very impressed. So I want to start off by first telling you a little story, because I would be greeting you today with Guten Morgen, which is Dutch for good morning, if it weren't for a little incident that took place, an obscure footnote in world history in the year 1744. So back then, the preeminent colonial power at the time around the world, the most powerful maritime seafaring economic empire, were the Dutch. They had colonies everywhere from Indonesia to southern Africa, the eastern coast of the USA. They even charted the coast of Tasmania and New Zealand. So things were going pretty well for the Dutch, until they decided to pick a fight with a really small, obscure kingdom in the southwest of India called Travancore, that had done the sin of invading and conquering the other little kingdoms around it. The Dutch's problem wasn't that these guys were a conquering army. That was all right. That's how you get things done in 1744. The problem was they refused to honor the agreement with the Dutch to allow only the Dutch to trade in pepper and spices in that area. So what ended up happening is this ragtag band of soldiers, many of them just fishermen with melee weapons, somehow managed to defeat the Dutch Empire. And that set in motion a chain of events that led to the collapse of the Dutch Empire. I mean, there were a number of other things, of course, but it all culminated in the Dutch Empire collapsing over a number of decades and creating a vacuum that was filled by the British Empire, who eventually went on to take over the whole of India, settle Australia, and build cities here and create the country we have today. So my point of telling you the story is, well, it's really two main points. The first is that what we understand as our society, as our civilization today, has many fathers. And some of them are not really Western, some of them are Eastern. We have a religious tradition and morality inspired by the Middle East, by Christian religion and so on, which in turn has some parallels to Buddhism that predates it, coincidentally or otherwise. We have our conception of rights, while developed uniquely in the West, has its progenitors in the East, in the pillar constructed by Cyrus the Great of Persia, for example. Even cosmopolitan societies, where human beings practice very different, religions and cultural traditions in private, but otherwise live together in harmony in the same city or in the same kingdom, have their history going back hundreds of years, as far back as ancient Afghanistan and India under the Kushan Empire, to even ancient Sumeria. In fact, Sumer, sorry about that, in fact, if you had to, come to a conclusion about who the fathers of Western civilization are, it would be an episode of Maury Povich and Jerry Springer. So at the end of the day, I think rather than focusing on this notion of Western civilization as a static thing that should be preserved and pushed, it's important that we continue the great Western tradition of absorbing influences that work and using them to build up our civilization and our culture, learning best practices, and of course, helping to spread them around, because it's a two-way street. There's a good reason why the countries and ex-colonies around the world that have performed the best have been the ones that have been most eager to take up the free market economy and had the strongest Western-based institutions. So with that being said, I think a lot has been said by the previous speakers about what is it that makes our society or civilization great? What are the great institutions and why should we preserve them? I'd like to look at what are the things that the West can still learn. What can we do to make the West great again, right? And there's still a lot to learn from around the world. So one of the things that we have in the West is we have the welfare state, of course. Probably Western countries have far stronger welfare states than most of the rest of the world. But one of the issues is our over-reliance on it. Australians, for example, have some of the lowest domestic savings levels in the world. That means that for a lot of people, if they lost their job or they lost their livelihood or something went wrong, their first source of support would be the government. Whereas in a lot of East Asian societies, we see a very strong savings culture. There's this emphasis on you save first and you spend later. And in some ways, Western consumerism is partly to blame for this willingness to go out and spend, as are things like Keynesian economic thinking, I would argue, which say that, a guy getting $1,000 in his pocket just going out and buying a TV, that's great, that's a good thing, that means the economy is moving. Not quite. You'd rather have him save that money, because all saving is it's a delayed expenditure. I'd rather he save that money and invest it in some shares or something that give him return down the track. That is real long-term growth. So that's something we can learn. The second thing we can learn is what I think is really the most important safety net of all, the family. Right? Now, I'm going to go slightly Cory Bernardi for a second, but I'm going to hold on to your seats. Cory Bernardi did not go far enough. Right? And here's why. When I arrived in this country, I was told that the traditional model of the family is the nuclear family, right, where you have two parents and a child. Some would argue they have to be of different genders. Not getting into that, but two parents and a child living in a household, having maybe a dog and a cat or some siblings, that's a family. And now we have a more modern conception of a family where, because of the high divorce rates and so on, it's a little less stable. For me, this was a really weird idea because growing up in India, the nuclear family was considered progressive and something new that had only been around for a few decades. The role model of a family is the joint family, where you have one large household or one large community, where you have cousins, nephews, nieces, uncles, grandparents living under one roof, supporting each other, pushing each other, providing not just some form of financial security if something went wrong in someone's life, but really providing that sort of emotional backbone, that support that's there. And if you clashed or had issues with your father or one of the people in your family, you had a network of uncles, nephews, people who you could go to and turn to without having to leave home. And you think about the world we live in today. I mean, millennials are one of the most depressed generations that we've seen. Amidst a time of amazing material prosperity, what is going on? Why is depression high? Why is suicide high? It might have something to do with the fact that most of us live in little compartmentalized urban agglomerations where we don't even know our next door neighbor. Maybe back in the day, going to church gave you that form of social support, but we're now a less religious society in that sense. So I think having a return back to those familial networks is probably a good thing. Now you might say it's too late to do that. I'm not just gonna, it's hard enough to get my family around the Christmas table. How am I going to get them into one house? Why would I do that? Fair enough. I think that probably it is a bit unrealistic at this stage. But there are things we can do that are probably more realistic. Some of them are happening already. A tendency in this country, in a lot of Western countries, is to, if your parents get old enough, ship them off to an old folks' home. Right? That's the usual thing. And it's changing slowly over time nowadays. In a lot of cultures, including the one I grew up in, that's considered insulting. That's considered degrading. The idea of ending up eating mashed potatoes in a little aged care home and then ending up on a current affair or in a Royal Commission inquiry, I think there's probably a better way of doing this. At the very least, I feel that younger people who are able to advance their careers and own a home and so on should be willing to host their parents and take better care of them. And perhaps one of the reasons why this is only a thing that's happening recently is that there's been this almost social contract where young people get kicked out of their homes in the West around the age of 18 or so. And it's slowly been pushed back and pushed back. And I think, getting over the stigma of helping out your children, helping them get a start and so on, could be a part of that. Because if if we want to have this culture where people respect their elders and defer to them, like we do in some societies, of course it has to be a two-way street. There needs to be a certain form of legitimacy. These intergenerational battles between the baby boomers, who've supposedly taken away a lot from millennials, and there's some truth to that, need to be overcome. I say all this not to give some sort of moral lesson, although I guess that I am doing that, aren't I? But also because if you believe in liberty, then you believe in reducing people's need to rely on the government. You believe in civil society and private institutions that are stable, that are objective, that have stood the test of time. So what I'd argue is I'm not actually asking for a change in Western civilization to make it like the East. I'm saying let's strengthen our capitalism. Let's strengthen this great system that we have in this country by allowing us to rely less on a government that, the moment it has control of our savings, will try to tax it more and more and more and use the money to buy votes and derail this great thing that we've managed to build. So I now want to touch on something that's perhaps a bit different because I feel that it hasn't, I guess, been covered yet by the others on the panel. This idea of Western civilization is controversial. I mean, it's hard enough to get, a privately funded academic institute to teach these traditions up and running. And one of the reasons I think is that there's this perception that if you endorse the West as an idea, as a construct, then you are in some way engaging in whitewashing the dark chapters like colonialism and slavery and so on, which of course, Western colonial empires were responsible for. There's also an argument to be made that a lot of the exploitation that happened in these third world countries was driven by capitalism. That's not my argument, that's the argument that people are making. But what I want to note is this. When the West was building its empires, it was also building something crucially important that other peoples also building empires, like the Turks, the Ottomans, for example, and the Chinese, were not really building at the time, and that is the modern idea of the nation state. This idea that you can have a state made up of institutions that would keep the ruling monarch in check. And the ruling monarch was not the absolute power. So if you ended up having a weak ruler, you had, by the, I forgot what year it was, but by the 1500s or 1600s or so, you had a parliament that could check the British monarch's power, for example. And of course, there were civil wars and these other things. But the fact is, the West was building institutions. It meant something to be British. It meant something to be French. To the point where if you ask someone in the Palestinian territories today, if you met that person 200 years ago and you asked them where they're from, they wouldn't say Palestine, they wouldn't say Syria, they would say, they might say Greater Syria. They'll point to a region or they'll point to an empire. And I think that the reason why the West was so successful, or one of them, was that they found these collapsing empires around the world and they took advantage of that fact, as any other empire would have done. But the lesson from that is build a strong nation, build strong institutions that can keep your despot accountable, right? Because the moment the king has a grandson who's a bit of a shit, everything goes downhill, right? So we need to have those checks and balances in place. Also, a lot of the time when countries were exploited by the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, it was done by deliberately undermining all the principles that the West stood for. So while capitalism was promoted and sold in the UK and in all these in the home countries, Indians had to pay an exorbitant tax on the cloth that they sold to themselves. So that cloth of a poorer quality that was more expensive, made in Manchester, could be sold to Indians at a cheaper price. Indians even had to have a license to harvest salt. Mahatma Gandhi, being a socialist, led a libertarian march to harvest salt as a form of civil disobedience. So the next time a socialist tells you that we shouldn't celebrate capitalism or celebrate the West, let them know that that's what the colonizers told the colonized. And I'm proud to be here and I'm proud to speak on this. So thanks.